Let me show you this. That is public school too. Remember that for later. In 1963, a man named Ernesto Miranda was pulled over in Arizona on suspicion of a kidnapping that had occurred 10 days earlier. Miranda was detained and interrogated by the Arizona police for several days. At the end of that, he produced a signed confession to the kidnapping of an 18-year-old girl. He was tried and convicted on this evidence. His lawyers appealed, saying that Miranda had not been told of his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, that is, his right to remain silent. Remember that pesky Fifth Amendment from last week? They argued that because Miranda hadn't been told about his right to remain silent, well, he would have said anything at all to the police, not knowing that it could incriminate him and not knowing he had a constitutional right to remain silent. Eventually, the case got appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the justices decided 5-4 that Miranda's lawyers were right. They said Miranda wasn't told about his right to remain silent, and so when he gave the police information that led to his eventual conviction, he wasn't acting in full protection of his constitutional rights. And so what this means as a practical matter is that he wasn't constitutionally convicted. The main outcome of the Miranda case was that police officers have to let people know about their constitutional rights when they are arresting them. This is why you have this famous line in every TV show and movie that when someone gets arrested post-1966, they say to them, you have the right
to remain silent.
I should remind you, you have the right to remain silent.
P. Jones, you have the right to remain silent.
Wait. You have the right to remain silent.
Walter White, you have the right to
remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, the court will appoint one for you. This is because you cannot interrogate a suspect without him knowing his rights. If he gives you evidence without having been read his rights, you cannot use that evidence in court against him because he has not been given the full constitutional protection of his Fifth Amendment rights. This is an example of how rights can come about from somewhere other than the amendments. Specifically, they can come from court cases. Because the thing is, the Constitution is not a self-interpreting document. And when there are conflicts over how to interpret what the Constitution says, these conflicts are generally taken to the courts. And the courts, the full structure of which we'll talk about later, will then decide how to interpret these amendments. And when the courts make a decision saying, well, actually, this amendment does imply that if someone's getting arrested, they have to be told they have a right to remain silent, then people have to follow that guidance or risk getting their evidence thrown out in court. So this is the second major way that fundamental American rights and liberties can come about, by court decisions interpreting the protections of the Constitution in specific cases. In 1961, a man named Clarence Gideon was arrested for an apparent robbery in Panama City, Florida. Gideon was poor and he couldn't afford an attorney. He told the court as much when the trial was starting. He said, I should be represented by an attorney, even though I'm poor. And he was told that Florida only provides an attorney in capital cases. And so he would have to defend himself without the help of an attorney. Gideon defended himself in court, and unsurprisingly, he lost and was sentenced for the crime of burglary. While he was serving time, he borrowed pencil and paper and hand-wrote an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, describing the facts of his trial and how he had been not given adequate representation. And in one of those kind of weird Hollywood turns of events, the Supreme Court actually decided to take on his case on the basis of this handwritten appeal that he sent in from prison. And after hearing the case in 1963, they decided Gideon was right, and actually people should be entitled to representation if they're accused of a crime and they're facing criminal trial. And so because of Gideon v. Wainwright, the 1963 Supreme Court decision, all of us now have the right to an attorney even if we can't afford one. This is one of the fundamental implications of the right to a speedy and fair trial. It's in a court of law, you need an attorney there to represent your interests, and the state will actually pay for you to have one if you can't afford it yourself. This is another famous example of a fundamental American right that has come about because of a court decision. This week we also had to read pieces by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass. Caddy Stanton is writing about the way that women are treated in the United States, and Frederick Douglass is writing about the way that former enslaved people are treated in the United States. And their causes are linked but different, and they both do something very interesting that I want to talk about. They both use language from the Declaration of Independence in their speeches. Now, this is very strange, actually, because both of these speeches are apparently, they're both criticizing the US and the US government. So why use language from the most famous American document? The answer, I think, is that they're both doing a uniquely American thing. They're arguing for a renewal and a rebirth of the American project, of the country that they live in. They're both saying, this country is flawed, and yet I want to keep it. I want to make it better. And so they say, just as in the Declaration of Independence, we declare a new birth of freedom for the people in this country, we declare a new birth of freedom. This is a uniquely American tradition. The country is sort of being renewed and reborn by its struggles. There's this saying that the US started off as the nation of George Washington, but we now live in the nation of Lincoln. What does that mean? Well, George Washington is the founding. He's big, beautiful flags and crossing the Delaware and defeating the British. What does Lincoln represent? Lincoln represents slavery. He represents the Civil War. He represents hundreds of thousands of dead Americans killing each other because the country couldn't find a solution to the problem of slavery. That's the country we now live in. It's a flawed country, but people are working hard to make it better. There's something that James Baldwin says in a later piece written in the 1960s. He says, "This country is celebrating 100 years of freedom, 100 years too soon." I'm here in front of Public School 002 in Chinatown. In February 1964, this school and many others across New York City were subject to a massive strike and walkout by New York City students and teachers. Over 400,000 students and teachers didn't come to school that day or walked off the job to protest ongoing school segregation in New York City. But wait, you might fairly ask. I thought that segregation was made illegal in the 1954 Brown v. Board court decision. And also, you say with an unusually good grasp of New York City law and history, segregation in schools has been illegal in New York City since 1920, even earlier than the Brown court decision. So why are people engaging in mass protest against segregation in schools that have been desegregated for, at that point, something like 40 years?
Malcolm X, what brings you here today?
Well, I'm out here to see the successful expose of the New York City school system. It proves that you don't have to go to Mississippi to find a segregated school system. We have it right here in New York City.
Are you supporting this boycott?
Yes, I did support it. I came as an observer, and I supported it because it shows that the problems that the white liberals have been pointing the finger at the southern segregationists and condemning them for exist right here in New York City.
Though schools had been desegregated in law, they had not been desegregated in practice, for the simple reason that you can desegregate schools all you want, but as long as people still go to school near where they live, if you have housing segregation, you will still have school segregation. Because the housing stock and the neighborhoods in New York City are still extremely segregated in the 1960s, and to a degree still extremely segregated today, the schools are therefore just as segregated as the housing stock. If the population in one district is 95% white, the kids attending the schools in that district will be 95% white. Compounding the problem is the fact that schools in the United States are funded almost exclusively through property taxes. They tax the property or the houses and land around the schools. Now, why is this a problem? The state of affairs that results from property taxes funding schools means that if you have valuable land and valuable houses around a school, then the school will receive a ton of funding. It will have money to burn. But if you have housing and land that is not valuable around the school, property taxes aren't going to raise very much money, are they? A 2% tax on a property that's worth $100 million is a lot of money. A 2% tax on a property that's worth $50,000 isn't that much money. It's certainly not enough to run a school. And so the fact that schools are funded via property taxes means that some schools in wealthy neighborhoods have a ton of money and other schools in poor neighborhoods have very little money at all. And you can realize how unusual this is if you just think about other government services for a second. So for example, the military in the United States is not funded via a property tax system. Think how silly that would be. Imagine if a military base had to just tax the houses around it to try to buy fighter jets and guns. You would have some military bases in rich neighborhoods that had nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers, and then you'd have others in poorer neighborhoods that would have to hold a bake sale to raise enough money to buy new boots. This would be a hugely inefficient and inequitable way of spending money on an army, so we don't do it. In fact, very few government services are administered through property taxes because it is such an inefficient and wasteful system. Other countries fund their school systems the same way they fund their militaries or their social services. Everyone pays taxes. Those taxes are put in a big pot or general fund, and then services that need money draw from the general fund. If the government were to switch to funding schools through the general fund and not through property taxes, this would have serious positive equity effects on most schools. That is, everyone would pull from the same general fund. Schools would have similar dollar amounts available to them, whether or not they're in a rich neighborhood or a poor neighborhood. For these historical reasons, schools today remain quite segregated in the United States. In some areas, segregation is actually worse than it was in 1954 when Brown v. Board was decided, and they remain inequitably funded. Some schools get more money, some schools get less money, and it mostly just has to do with how valuable their parents' houses are. But the picture is always more complicated in And if the old problems aren't being solved, they're at least changing in nature. Take, for example, Public School 2, Meyer London, the one that we're at right now. This school is about 75% Asian students, about 15% Latin students, and 10% everyone else. And the students here are not particularly well off. About 93% are on free or reduced lunch programs. Students will come into kindergarten speaking very little English. They mostly speak
Cantonese, Mandarin, or Spanish at home.
And by the second grade, they're completely fluent, and they're happy to discuss anything from snails to photosynthesis with you. So this is an American success story, PS2 down here. It's a bunch of kids who come here who are not rich, who do not speak English, and they come out the other end knowing a whole lot. And the United States is a big place with a lot of people in it and plenty of swing sets.